All right, setting up your meeting for Facebook Live. And we're live. Well, this is great. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for everybody who's joining us on Facebook. I'm Ben Pogue. In case you don't know me already, I'm an attorney and a small business owner. I'm a member of the South Carolina Bar House of Delegates, also a member of the North Charleston RECAP team with the North Charleston Police Department. RECAP stands for Rebuilding Every Community Around Peace. It's a community policing organization really focused on promoting peace and partnership and intervention between the community and our law enforcement professionals over in North Charleston. I'm also on the board of East Cooper Faith Network and Trident Literacy Association. And I'm also a candidate for Ninth Circuit Solicitor, which is all of Berkeley and all of Charleston counties. Solicitors like district attorney every other place. And I'm really honored to have great panelists with us this evening to talk about this new perspective of restorative justice as it applies to empowering victims. And folks will say, what is restorative justice or community justice? It's really about two main things that we're going to be focusing on through the remainder of our campaign, and hopefully in the future after that. Restorative justice and community justice really is about expanding the circle of individuals from the community that are involved in the justice process. That's really part one, getting more community members involved in justice so that we really can make it more accessible and provide justice for everyone. The other key part of it is really shifting our focus on justice to healing the harm of violence and injustice out there. And a lot of times that means really focusing on the experience of victims and survivors. Victims and survivors provide a tremendous perspective on what crime was like, what violence was like when they experienced it or when a family member has experienced it. But they also give us data about why crime and violence happen and maybe how we can forge a path forward that heals not only the victim, but their family, their community members, their neighborhood, and even to the extent that it's possible, the offenders who we want to make sure when they get out, and 95% of offenders get out of prison, that they can be in a better position so that we can keep our entire community safe and really value everybody in it. So with that idea of what restorative justice is about, as I mentioned, our topic this evening is empowering victims. We're going to be talking about other facets of the criminal justice system, other facets of community justice, but tonight is really focused on victim experiences, survivor experiences, how we protect victims and survivors, how we help them through trauma, through the healing process, and through real life obstacles that they face, as well as allowing them, if and when they want to do it on their terms, interacting with offenders and seeing if we can forge a path to a better rehabilitative process. Victims and survivors really need to be validated in their experiences. And as I mentioned, they've got a tremendous wealth of knowledge that we can really use to ultimately keep us all safe and reduce violence, reduce crime in every community. And we've got three particularly phenomenal individuals who are experienced in their own right, dealing with trauma and dealing with folks who have been through violence from a domestic violence standpoint, from a gun violence standpoint. I'll start off introducing my friend Tisa Wack. Tisa is a master's degree candidate in business. She's phenomenal. She's the founder of We Are Their Voices, a nonprofit focusing on victims in gun violence, and also a founding member of Taking Back Our Village, which is a community organization really dedicated to improving the overall health and wealth of communities. She's also a member of the Every Town Survivor Network and Moms Demand Action, as well as the Tri-County Gun Violence Coordinating Council. Erica Cokley, a friend of mine, also joins us today. She's a community advocate, a tireless community advocate. Erica is everywhere, marching in 100-degree heat all over the place. And she is the executive director of Voices United, which is a tremendous organization addressing some of today's problems, a wide spectrum of problems, and really providing proactive ways to engage and regain the trust of the youth in our community through education and awareness and partnerships and collaboration. And Erica also studied business at Strayer University, so she's got a wide spectrum of knowledge. And Mackie Moore also joining us. Hi, Mackie.
Hi,
Mackie's the founder and CEO of Thrive Saves Lives, a tremendous organization and initiative to provide transitional housing, services, and holistic resources for survivors of domestic violence and their family pets, which is a really important part of the equation, and an initiative that helps us eradicate violence against women and children in the state of South Carolina. Mackie is also a domestic violence victims advocate in general and a documentary film producer who's been involved in the nonprofit world for 25 years. So thank you all for being here. If you all don't mind, I'd really like to start by allowing each of you, Tisa, why don't we start with you, to get a sense of what your perspective is and what your experience is. Just briefly, we'll go through each one of the panelists and then we'll get into more of the discussion. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I appreciate you having me on. Like Ben said, my name is Tisa, and how I came about into this spectrum of restorative justice and empowering victims is that my son Tyrell, my only child, was murdered in 2015 along with his friend, 21-year-old friend. My son was 23 at the time, and they both were murdered due to senseless act of gun violence. And after that happened, I went into a transition of, I don't know what to do. What do I have to live for? Because, you know, this is my only child. I didn't think I can pick myself back up. But a friend of mine, mutual friend of mine, her son was killed in the same neighborhood a year before. Her only child. Our lives were kind of parallel because we both had grandchildren that were left behind after our sons were killed. And we said, we were talking one day, and we said, we have to be the voices of our children. And their birth, we are the voices. So not only are we striving to be the voices of our sons, my co-founder, Chandra Bryant, but her son, Shaq, and my son, Tyrell, and any other victims of gun violence. We want to be able to support those people who are grieving and who have went through this trauma and kind of navigate through the system into a point of healing and restoration, because we'll never forget our children. And we'll never forget our loved ones, but we want to be able to make something good coming out of something so tragic.
Tisa, thanks for sharing this. And one thing I wanted to mention, we do have folks who have endured violence and who are survivors. So for everybody who's joining us on Facebook, through our event page, and for all of our participants, obviously, one of the things that we talked about early on was just making sure that there's a safe space for everyone. So we're really going to focus on being positive and supportive in this forum tonight. So thank you for sharing that, Tisa. I really appreciate it. Erica, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience and perspective?
Thank you very much, Ben, again, for having me on here tonight. My name is Erica Cokley, as Ben said, and I am the founder of Voices United. And how I found myself into this was my only brother was actually murdered due to gun violence, and it's actually been 6 years already. And that was a hard pill for me to swallow, because it's one of those things that it's nobody else's right to take away someone that you love, you know. And when it put me in a dark place, it put me in a dark place because my brother left children. And I knew what it was like to grow up without a parent being there. So having my brother not being here and him having children left in this world, it was me not only coping, but I knew these children were coping. And to not understand or know how they were coping or how they were dealing, I found myself just trying to advocate for other children and not letting my brother die in vain, you know, trying to leave the world better than which it was that I found it. You know, that if I couldn't do anything for my children or his children that I probably wouldn't get a chance to see, I found myself advocating for other people's children as well as myself to make sure that I do leave the world better, to try to reach them some way, somehow.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Erica. Yeah, it's an incredible perspective when you're left picking up the pieces for somebody else, especially a family member. It's one of the parts where we've got some weaknesses in the system where we want to really see if we can address that. Thanks again, Erica. Mackie,
Thank
if you
you.
could share with us your story, your history of advocacy and your experience working with victims of domestic violence.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me tonight, Ben. And I'm really excited about your run for solicitor. Um, I am Mackie Moore, and I worked at my sister's house for several years, which is an emergency shelter in Charleston for the Tri-County area. And for over 700,000 residents in the Tri-County area, there are only 36 beds for domestic violence survivors. When I went to work for my sister's house, I quickly saw the lack of housing, the lack of resources, the lack of community unity over this issue. And we're not just talking about women, we're also talking about children, and we're talking about family pets, because women and children oftentimes will not leave their abuser for fear of what will happen to the pet. And the pet is usually the first one to get it. So, so when I was at my sister's house, I saw how desperate the need was for transitional housing, so that after somebody has an emergency and they go into a shelter situation, like my sister's house, which provides shelter and resources for 60 days, then what happens? And what I was seeing is not much was happening. They were returning to their abusers because there was such a lack of housing, such a lack of resources and services and employment opportunities, job training. And so the average victim in South Carolina returns to her abuser an average of 9 times before she is either murdered or she finally gets out of the situation. And it may sound like I'm being dramatic. Well, 9 times, and she's either murdered or she finally can leave because somebody's helping her, or she has some resources, or she decides to go live in her car or live under a bridge or on the street. So I'm actually not overstating the problem, because South Carolina has at several times in the past 20 years has been #1 in the country for the number of women murdered by men per year, at a rate of more than double the national average. So women are being murdered more often than any other state in the country. And this has been going on for a very long time. And there just has not been enough advocacy, enough help, enough support for women in the state. And I saw the need, and the need was so great that I couldn't turn a blind eye. And I felt the obligation as a female, and as a person who believes in justice and fairness, that I would start an organization to provide transitional housing and holistic services and resources for women and children, and then also a place to keep family pets so that they can leave and they can stay at Thrive for up to a year. So in a year, a lot can be done to rehabilitate a person, and for a person to be able to rehabilitate themselves, frankly, and for children to be in a peaceful environment, and for the mother and the child to be able to heal together, and then to move on and have a productive, peaceful life. So that is my goal for every woman in South Carolina.
That's a great goal. Thank you. And Mackie, while we're on you, and Tisa, I'm going to unmute you also, because I'd like you to weigh on this. When we first think of violence happening, whether it's domestic violence or whether there's violence in a neighborhood, And Tisa, you've got a different take on this as well. When we have neighborhood violence, sometimes it's not dissimilar to domestic violence in some ways, in that you're connected, you share connections with the people who have violent interactions. But even before really awful stuff happens, sometimes there are signs. But one of the things that we find is that folks are really reluctant to report those initial stages of violence. Sometimes it's shame, sometimes it's guilt, sometimes it's familial or friendship relations in a neighborhood, and sometimes it's a distrust in the system. So Mackie and Tisa, if you could both talk to us about your experiences in the obstacles to, first of all, reporting the crime. We know that nationwide, only about half of violent crime is reported in the first place. Talk to us about some of the obstacles, whether they're emotional, psychological, whether they're practical in terms of a neighborhood or a family. What's your perspective on that?
I think for me, it's a little bit of all of that, because when you talk about the neighborhood dynamics, and especially dealing with young people, because right now, we have a hard time seeing some kids turn 25, and they get caught up in maybe sometimes a lifestyle or trying to prove something to their peers, because it's a false facade that's being created, and they're trying to live up to it. I use my son as an example because, typically you think that most kids involved in some type of gun violence came from, a very poor neighborhood, or you're just caught up in just different dynamics of life. But my son was the opposite. I mean, we pretty much grew up middle class. We didn't have a lot, but I had what he needed, and I always showed him how to work for what he needed and gave him an example to follow. But, dealing with his peers, people who called him spoiled, or he seemed like he had to prove something to them. And by proving that, sometimes he got himself in trouble and got himself caught and tangled up in the law. And instead of trying to kind of get down to the background of why is this kid who appears to come from really good, stable home is acting out like this, it was more giving them the punishment versus trying to figure out what the root cause of it was. So I think that's all that emotions, because it's a kid who hadn't quite found himself yet, and they're still growing and trying to develop and trying to find their way in life. And sometimes they get distracted by the materialistic things and the things that the world is showing them versus what reality is. So that's just a little bit of my insight. And I think that, just the punishment without really understanding why it's happening is a part of some of the problems, which, once the kid gets a record, then it's hard for him to find a job, him or her to find a job. And it's like they're being constantly punished, even though maybe 2 or 3 years after that, their mindset have changed, but the system is based on something they did 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So it's like they're always trying to get out of that cycle, which then comes to frustration, which sometimes leads to what Mackie was saying with domestic violence, because we know sometimes tempers flare, and then now you're in a whole different realm of things. So that's just a little bit of my insight on that.
Tisa, it sounds almost like you're describing a situation where people who are in those beginning of stages of sort of losing their grasp on a really good path feel some degree of guilt and shame in the process. Like, oh no, well, maybe I don't want to elevate this to involve law enforcement because I don't feel good about what I did, or I'm afraid that I'm going to be dragged into it. Is that part of it?
Yeah, I think it's a part of, they know right from wrong, but they get caught in a position where they don't feel like they can confide in law enforcement or those people that can help them get out of it without being called a snitch, without being labeled a certain way, even though morally it's the right thing to do. So that's a part of the dynamics of it, and where the reality of what needs to happen and what the justice system may perceive them to be from their peers. Now they feel like a conflict. So it's an evil balance.
And Mackie, it sounds like those things are, like I said, not dissimilar from the way that some victims of domestic abuse, intimate partner abuse, sort of feel like this juxtaposition of maybe not trusting that law enforcement or the justice system would give them what they need, the protection that they need, but then also some level of guilt in the process, which is really irrational.
You know, it's a really complicated situation. It's so multifaceted when it comes to domestic violence, because you have love, you know, and a relationship that has value, and you know, and you have a woman who is abused still has emotional ties to her abuser. It's not like you know, someone hits a woman and then she doesn't have feelings for him anymore. It doesn't work like that. And I almost liken it to having to take tentacles off of somebody. It's like they keep wanting to come back and grasp the victim. So it's tough because, first of all, you have that emotional connection. Second of all, there is a definite fear that the justice system is not going to be there for them. And Ben, unfortunately, a lot of times that's true. I have been to court with women on so many occasions when there's a lot of victim blaming and victim shaming. Mm-hmm. And it's not about the perpetrator, it's about the victim and what has she done wrong, or what has she done to cause this violence. Or I've had a judge say openly in court, why am I going to give you a restraining order when you're just going to go back to him? It's
That's brutal. That is the worst.
Brutal. And when I tell you, we went in with a complete book of evidence, and I'm not underestimating this, but it's a good old boys club out there in a lot of ways, and men are supporting men. And, you know, there are a lot of great policemen out there, but there are also policemen out there that will come to a scene and not be able to be objective about what they're seeing. It's sort of a guys club. And what did she do to cause this, or did she do anything to you? Or they may see a woman who's been choked, and they don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, and so we don't have the training where it needs to be.
Exactly. That's part of the issue, is that there needs to be so much more training. And I think about, this is such a great example, is that a woman who's been choked also looks like a woman who's intoxicated.
Right.
So if a police officer goes out and sees a woman who looks like she's, you know, been drinking heavily, and then she can barely even get her words out, it's very hard for the police officer to understand that she's actually being very credible and that she's just been choked. And there are not always marks left right away. Mm-hmm. And so there are so many. And then even if a perpetrator is picked up and taken to jail, he's normally let out so quickly that he comes back and is more furious than he was when he left. And it
means that if somebody's been strangled, this is why felony strangulation is a big push for that, is that now we know that people who strangle are more likely to kill.
Right. Later on. Exactly. But there's, so when she goes back, there's even more fear about what's going to happen. But you have to understand that probably she has children. Probably she's staying home with the children or working part-time, but he may very often be the breadwinner. So it's not like she can just leave the situation and take her children and live her life. There's a lot to leaving a situation where you're living with an abuser. It's not just why doesn't she just leave? There's so many logistics to it, not just monetarily, but also women who leave are often cast out of their social environment. So the other couples that they hang out with very often will take the side of the abuser. And I'm going to give you a quick example. Often the abuser is the life of the party. He's the guy in the neighborhood who's charismatic and dynamic and is very attractive to the neighborhood, and maybe he's the one that has all the bonfires and the parties and the oyster roasts, and everybody loves him, and they think she's a little odd and she's kind of quiet and standoffish and maybe keeps to herself, and we can't really relate with her as much. Well, what they don't know is that she's being abused, that she's behind closed doors being beaten, being deprived of all kinds of things: money, food, clothing, medical attention. And so when she finally leaves, she becomes the outcast, and she becomes the one that loses everything, not just her house, not just her husband, but all of her friends, her family members often don't believe it's happening. So
on top of that, she's got to deal with the guilt of other people not understanding, and then this reinforcement from the establishment that, like you were saying, the judge said, did this person do something? It's irrational. It doesn't make any sense, but did this person do something to deserve it?
Exactly.
The guilt is a huge part. There's a great discussion on that for people who are, and you and I have talked about this book, No Visible Bruises, and I think we put a link to it on there, from Rachel Louise Snyder. Phenomenal book. Talks a lot about the strangulation part, talks a lot about police officers who are frequently undertrained, and we do have a higher incidence of domestic violence among police officers. There are many, many great police officers.
Right.
We've also got to recognize what the challenges there are. And Mackie, you brought up the issue of, well, really the tremendous burden that guilt and shame can have on victims of domestic violence, but that really translates into victims of all kinds. We know from psychological studies that it's one of the most consistent threads in victims and survivors. They feel guilt that what could I have done? What should I have done?
Right.
And Erica, I really want to get your perspective on this as a survivor. When you're left with a family member who has passed away, whose life has really been taken, one of the things we frequently hear from survivors are, what could I have done? Is there something that I should have done to know that this was going to happen? Which are totally irrational thoughts, but often they just carry with people. And if you could talk about your experience, that would be great.
Well, it's actually even, I just hate to say ironic that we even having this conversation tonight, because all the things that I always thought that what could I have done, I was actually just talking to a friend today. And again, my nephew is here with me right now, and he's hearing me loud and clear. So I hope he understands how important and how much this means to me. But the last time that I saw my brother, had I known the things that I know now, I kept saying, if I knew that then, I would have brought him here, if there was something that I could do. So even just today, and I love you, nephew, I love you, because he's in earshot. I call it a breakthrough. And that's enough for me going forward. But I had no idea that my nephew all of this time has been carrying the burden, that he's the reason that my brother was killed.
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
So literally, we had this conversation today. I haven't seen him since he was 10. And again, he's in earshot. So I want him to know that I'm happy that I'm doing this right now. But I had no idea he felt that way. And I had to tell him, I thought that if it was something that I could have done, but I needed him to know that there was nothing that you done, there was nothing that you could have done. And that's something that right now, we're just now learning, so we're going to be dealing with. But I already thought that there was something that I could have done. And if there was nothing that I could have done then, that's where Voices United comes from. What can I do now going forward?
Right. And, you know, Erica, sharing your story is a huge part of that, and sharing those emotions. And I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you very much. And, you know, it's a story that we do hear from other folks, but it's one of those things that people who've experienced violent crime are so reluctant to admit that they feel like they had something to do with it. And, you know, and Erica, one of the things, and you and I have talked about this, one of the problems that we have in terms of racial equity and racial bias is that we know studies have shown, and I think we're going to share a study that was done, that African Americans are more likely, even when they are victims, to be shouldered with some of that blame, especially by lawyers, by jurors, and by the media as well. And so there's this added burden that often we don't recognize. We don't recognize our own racial bias. You know, it's something that I'm working on, that we hope lots of folks who look like me especially are working on. And it's still like there's this added burden, and that seems to get in the way, not just of what's happening in the moment psychologically and emotionally, and dealing with the aftermath, and then also dealing with the justice process, where we need our victims and survivors to understand that their feelings are normal and to be guided through that process of healing. But when there's this thread of blame or shame that goes along with it, it makes it really difficult, and difficult for somebody like your situation, where somebody has left kids, where there are family members and other practical things to take care of, where you got to not just step up and heal yourself, but step up and try and heal everybody else.
Trying to heal other people too. And it's even harder sometimes, you think, when, like you said, and it's not, you know, some people would be embarrassed, but my brother, he was killed to gun violence. But I remember telling someone my brother was shot, and he looked at me and he was like, was he doing something bad? And I kind of looked at him like, you know, really, you know, first of all, end the conversation.
Yeah.
The thing was, and not to say whether or not anyone was doing something bad, whether or not someone was doing something good, no one deserves to take the life of another person, first of all. Secondly, and I'll just say it, my brother was in the right place, just happened to be at the wrong time. He was coming to the aid of a friend, of a female friend who was being beat by a man, like we're talking about domestic violence, and he was this man that stepped in place of this, and he was actually killed by another person. So, you know, like you said, the shaming part, some people would be ashamed as, you know, why their person got killed, gun violence, whatever. And, you know, that would be the thing with the justice system. They would look at us and think, okay, you know, you're Black, you got killed, that's just it. So that's where the, you know, the trust comes in after, the trying to get justice going forward after, because sometimes they think, okay, you were Black, you were shot, that's just probably something that you deserve. So, you know, those are some of the things that we deal with, like you said, psychologically, mentally, you know, as a family. You know, not only do we feel like, how could we have prevented it, you know, or then you get the victim shaming, like they said, sometimes when we are victims, that's the victim shaming part. Was he doing something bad? Was he in a place that he wasn't supposed to be in? So instead of looking at it for a person's life just being taken, or something just happening to a person, whether it's a person of color, whether it's a man or female, we just need to take it for what it is and make sure the justice and the resources are there for the people.
Thanks, Erica. And talking about justice, and Mackie, Tisa, Erica, I'm really interested in what each of you have to say. Through the process, we have victims advocates, and they're passionate people who do their absolute best, and frequently they don't have the resources that we need. I think in North Charleston Police Department, I believe we've got 4 victims advocates, and there are about 5,000 violent cases that come on in per year. So that's 1,250 per person, roughly. That's just, it's an insane amount. So through that justice process, in the immediate aftermath, and it often takes a long time, what are some of the things that you and that friends of yours, your advocates, people who you've interacted with, really want more of from the justice system in terms of validating their experience and helping heal them along the way? Feel free to jump in, whoever wants to.
I mean, for me, Ben, it's, I think me and you talked about this a while back when we talked about survivors and them not having the ability to have a support network, because it's kind of like you're going through court, you're going through bond hearing, you're going through all these things, and there's no one to help you navigate necessarily in the way that you may need to, because immediately after my son was killed, of course, things are thrown at you, but you're not in a state of mind to remember any of that. I mean, they're giving you, here's your victim advocate. Here's
trauma,
this,
right?
yeah, you're dealing with a trauma and people are trying to give you information and they think that a week later you remember exactly, well, you're supposed to fill out this form. What form? So I think that definitely they're overwhelmed because like you said, Ben, we was talking about North Charleston and we knew how many advocates and what the ratio of victims was. And it was like, this was insane. How are they expected to be able to help these people efficiently? So one thing I would say the justice system needs to do, they need to put more people in place and more people with clinical backgrounds to deal with trauma and grief, because in a lot of cases, your victim advocates don't have that type of training to navigate through those aspects of things, and they're doing the best they can. They're trying to keep up with it. I mean, it came to the point that when I lost my son and I got to a point where I know I needed more, I needed to go to counseling, I needed more of something that I wasn't able to know where the resources were. We ended up starting our own nonprofit group. I mean, our own support group where we can navigate and we can talk to each other to talk about how we feel. And then my experience, it'll be 5 years this year was killed, but they may be a parent or a family, someone who's been a victim that we can advise on, oh, this is what happened when we went to court. This is what you should expect. You may need help writing your impact statement. Let me sit down and I can show you mine, and just comparing notes and honestly having an open space for us to talk, to say, this is how I feel and not be judged by it. I think Erica made a great point about the victim shaming. I just don't understand, because when someone's murdered, why is it that their past is brought up? Why is it that you have to dissect them and tear them down and guess, well, they must have been doing something wrong? Why is it an automatic that they were doing something wrong? Maybe they did something wrong 5 years ago, but you're still judging them and bringing it up because they're now a victim of a murder. It's a very tactless thing to do, and for people to victimize the victim, you feel like you victimize over and over and over again.
It's devaluing somebody tremendously.
Right. It's like, so you're trying to say that just because someone might have made a mistake or done something wrong in the past, that they deserve everything, they deserve to be murdered. No one has the right to take a life, and by doing that, it seems like people are trying to justify the action, and that is hurtful to the family, and it's just unnecessary. I mean, it's a grieving process that lasts longer than people probably ever imagined, and just to the violence itself, because
while you're in trauma too.
Yeah, while you're in trauma, and then just bringing up the fact that just the legal system, the court system, the time it takes, because if I'm not mistaken, it's kind of like, the accuser has the right to a speedy trial and be able to get the things that they need. But what about the victim? I remember 2.5 years later, us going to court to finally seek justice for the killing of my son and his friend. And the delays that happened in between that were him changing lawyers, him getting a new lawyer. This lawyer has to come up to speed. And it's almost like you going through that trauma each time, because now you don't even know what your next day or month could be, because you have to put everything on hold. In our case, because we don't know when court is going to come, and we're going to have to make sure that we don't take any days off work because we're going to need to be in court, and you just on pins and needles. And then you're thinking, when we get to court, is he going to get off? I mean, I must say, for my sake, our victim advocates, they were very helpful, but I know they can't navigate each case the way that they did. But I just think the victim is still a victim, even when you go on a trial.
And it sounds like, Tisa, part of the issue might be that you're sort of, you're always on call, but you're not consistently being supported at the same time.
Right.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's about right. It's like you're on call, your life is on hold, and you're at the mercy of that person who victimized you because you still waiting for them to tell you what the next step is.
It's like
You're
hurry up,
waiting on them.
hurry up and then wait, and hurry up and wait. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things I wonder if that's an area where we could really benefit, where victims and survivors could really benefit from more community interaction if there were community groups or a better community network to provide some consistency so that even if the process was long, even if there were legal obstacles that drew out the timeline, that at least if you could have some consistency and have somebody who understood the practical troubles that you might have, whether it's sometimes housing insecurity, especially for folks who don't have as much. I mean, they still have violence in their lives, and a violent experience is still devastating to them, maybe even more so devastating when they don't have good health care, don't have dependable transportation, don't have a dependable cell phone, et cetera. And Erica, I wanted to get your take on this as well, because sometimes the survivors are not the immediate family members, or the survivors, if they are immediate family members, are not just dealing with the trauma of loss, but also dealing with all these strange practicalities of new family dynamics and new family management along the way.
And that's something, yeah, and it has been hard because, again, my brother and I, we grew up, you kind of grew apart, but those relationships are still there. When each one of those children, my nieces and nephew, were born, I remember, being there. So when this happened, I think that was the first time that they all were in the same place at the exact same time. So, death drew them all together, but now he's no longer here. So they're growing apart, and again, he just said today, I want to know my sister, and he can't even remember her name, which is a hurtful thing because, again, they're separated. So the resources, as far as the families of, getting these children help, getting them help so that they can all be together, for the mothers to raise the children together so that they know this one person created them all, to advocate for them, to make sure that mentally that they're okay. Even like for myself, I didn't navigate the entire process. I went to Colombia. My brother, everything happened. He was buried. I know only because I think I was looking for help navigating it myself that I realized that there were victim services, for people. And when you think of victims or survivors of gun violence, I guess I was always thinking it was more or less the children and never really me, until I went forward and I realized, I am a survivor because I did lose him, and just other things that you actually deal with in terms of it, not realizing that it affects you the most. So having a support system, not just for, the immediate, the parents, the children, the siblings, being able to let them know what's out there for us in terms of how they're going to be taken care of. I heard there were things that were able to and it's not all about money, but I knew there were some things or resources that were available to them that, again, if no one's telling you about it and how to navigate the system, no one's going to utilize it, or someone could take advantage of it or use it in another way. So I think resources have to be there to just educate. And that's what I'm big about, educating and empowerment. But we have to have the support system there, but we have to have the resources there to allocate to make sure that it's there for them.
It sounds like resources, having those community resources is a huge part of a potential solution. And maybe we don't have enough of that. Maybe we need to be leaning on the community more. And really, it's no surprise that I'm going to say this to our panelists and to our participants, is that probably the area of the realm of violent crime where there's the most disruption to a family unit is in the realm of intimate partner violence. And I mean, you talk about an entire system being uprooted. Mackie, could you talk a little bit about that, and again about the lack of resources, maybe resources that we really need to work on so that we can give victims of intimate partner violence, victims of any kind of violence, better resources, and maybe lean on the community a little bit more. Could you go over that with us? What's your perspective?
Yeah, Ben, one thing that I've been working on, and that I would really like to see, which has happened in other places, and apparently was here for a little while, and I'm not exactly sure why it didn't take at the time, but I think it was when things were a little less progressive. But I would like to see a domestic violence court where only domestic violence issues are tried in this court. And what that means is that everyone who is part of the ecosystem of this court is very well educated when it comes to domestic violence, and they understand the dynamics, where a judge doesn't say, oh, I'm not going to do anything because you're just going to go back again. Where a victim doesn't have to stand outside of the courtroom with her abuser 2 feet from her, so that she's pretty shaken and a lot of times unable to function, because the perpetrator is still there, and it's scary, and it's bringing up a lot of bad memories, and so to me there needs to be established a domestic violence court, like again there are in other places in the country, where everyone is highly educated as to the dynamics of domestic violence and of how difficult it is to be in court with a perpetrator, or to have support going to court, so that there's an advocate that literally goes and sits with you in court, even if you don't have a family member, or if your friends have said they're not taking sides, or family members were not taking sides. The victim needs to have that support, and feel like they're not alone. And for
How far are we away from really having the resources that we need in South Carolina?
you know, I think it's like a lot of things. I think the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and we've recently brought on a couple of board members who are family court judges, who are very interested in seeing this happen. And I think we're going to have to raise a lot of what to get what we want, but that's what we're here for. So my goal is to see this happen, and to see this happen as soon as you can make it happen.
Absolutely. Well, we're certainly going to be working on that as a priority. And you mentioned other places that have domestic violence courts, and another thing that we see in some areas, and we shared it in the chat, and I think we can share it on Facebook as well, is that some of the places around the country have something called a family justice center model.
Yes.
It's really it's a beginning to end kind of model where, it starts with one really novel concept, but one that we really need to just get on board with. And that's that the person who is complaining of violence against them is valid. We believe them. First of all, first and foremost, right away, we believe them. And the studies seem to show that there's that false reporting is such a rarity.
Yes.
That we need to just assume, look, when somebody complains, it's because there's a really serious problem. We need folks who really understand the dynamics of that a little bit better, and that understand, frankly, that there are people who will complain, but then are under such a threat that they would later recant. And if you haven't seen the Netflix series Unbelievable, you have to watch that series, as difficult as it is. Unbelievable on Netflix. I believe that there's a book that goes out now, and we can put a link to the wiki page for it. But we've got to have that first step. We're going to believe victims and understand where they are in the process. But family justice centers, they really, as soon as there's a complaint, they take that individual and their kids and they care for them, put them in a properly supportive environment, and they don't have to interact with their abuser at all.
Right.
And then they have a very well-designed and protected path through the courts, through the entire process. And I know a lot of folks, when we hear about new programs, think about funding. Well, first of all, people's lives are more important in some respects, but also what we see in some of these areas is that they pay for themselves, because domestic violence, intimate partner violence can be so costly for families and for an entire region if you're not doing your job to really fix it.
Well, there are such economic impacts.
Huge.
It's huge. It's billions of dollars a year that are wasted from work days that can't be done because a woman's bruised and battered and can't present herself in public without it being very obvious. And that is shaming and embarrassing, even though it shouldn't be, because she's not the one that did it, but that's the way it feels to the victim. And it's the way people respond when they see a woman with bruises all over her, or coming forward and saying, this is what happened to me. And I love the idea of that Family Justice Center, where it's like a one-stop shop, and
exactly what it is.
It's brilliant. And I just looked at a model, and I think it's in Polk County in North Carolina, where they're doing this and they're having a lot of success with it. And
Yeah.
I don't understand how in the year 2020, we aren't much further along in helping victims of violent crimes, be it gun violence, be it at the hands of another.
Especially when we know that people who experience violence often end up people who cause violence later on. That's just a huge marker, and especially kids in the realm of whether it's neighborhood violence, and sometimes now our reality is that sometimes involves gun violence. Those kids end up predisposed to doing poorly in school, being more targeted by really career criminals who sort of take them off the wayward path, and then being potentially intimate abusers themselves. And that kind of preventative maintenance for crime, that's a way we can really start reducing crime, whether we're thinking of gun violence, whether we're thinking of other types of violence or intimate partner violence. And thank you all so much. One of the things that I want to do is sort of take a different turn. We're going to go into a quick breakout session. I'm going to assign everybody here. One of the things that's part of community justice and restorative justice is that victims and survivors are sometimes left out of the process of what the rehabilitation is for their offender. So one of the questions I'd like our participants to ask, as I put you into breakout sessions here just for a few minutes, and I'll go from room to room to room, is the question, two questions really, that I'd like you to talk about briefly. And we'll only be in the breakout sessions for about 5 minutes, so if you can get through them quickly, that'd be great. First of all, if you could ask your offender something, or an offender something, what would that be? We know that people have an offender is an individual, and they might be a career criminal, but they might be a person who has a journey there to becoming a more positive influence in their community. But that takes a lot of steps. So what is something that you would ask an offender or the person who is involved in the violence against you? And the other part of it is, if you knew that the offender would be, that this individual would eventually be released from prison, and as I mentioned, 95% of people who are in prison are getting out, what would you want their experience to be like? A punitive kind of experience, or a rehabilitative kind of experience, an experience that involves a victim or not? What kind of ideas do we have? So with those two questions in mind, I'm going to assign folks to breakout rooms somewhat, randomly here, and I'll put you guys in there, and then I'll be able to talk to our Facebook group for just a little bit. And 2, 3. Oh, actually, and DJ Don Polite, I'm going to keep you with me and assign everybody else. Okay, so there you all. You can join your rooms. And DJ, if you don't mind hanging out for just a second, and I'll talk to you because, and I'll see everybody else in just a couple minutes. But DJ, you are going to be on next week's forum. And we're also going to be joined by North Carolina Central professor and chair of the Criminal Justice Department over there, a friend of mine actually from high school, Dr. Robert Brown. And we're going to be talking about race and the history of race, how it impacts the justice system, how racial bias intersects with the current justice system, and what are the historical perspectives. And you are one of my great resources on a historical perspective. So can you tell our viewers and talk to me just briefly about the things that you're studying right now? And I'll mute myself.
So most of my research actually looks at the intersection of U.S. empire with U.S. Jim Crow South policies. So I do a lot of work on the U.S. and how at the turn of the 1900s, the country is really dealing with political power and who can wield it, who should not. And so you get this big growth into empire in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Also, while all these Southern politicians are really invested in Jim Crow disenfranchisement. And those things aren't just happening at the same time by coincidence. There's this real question of who gets to wield power and for what reason, who could get full power of citizenship and for what reason. And a lot of that is, of course, built on race, but also deals with questions of gender, sexuality, things of that nature. Of course, all those things are always intertwined, but race being a big factor of that. And then what is the long-lasting impact on who do we believe and what are the kind of circumstances that we believe is okay to say, actually, this person in this circumstance doesn't deserve full citizenship rights. And for why? Whether that be in immigration, whether that be in a question of voting rights, whether it be a question of the courts and who can get what resources from the courts or why not. And so that is a lot of what my research looks at.
I gotta ask you, have you watched Hamilton?
Of course I watched Hamilton.
Yeah, right, we're talking about, these seem like some real foundational political philosophical ideas, but it also seems like they have real world applications to how we operate right now, especially how we operate in the criminal justice system, where offenders go through and their rights are basically stripped under the 13th Amendment. They're still allowed to do that. How do we reincorporate, and do we make the decision about whether we want to reincorporate people into our society and give them a pathway to success? What are the risks that are inherent in that? And what are our real political and philosophical values in terms of how we really think of people and think of their individual worth and value?
Absolutely. I mean, it is a question of like the criminal justice system and how do we move through the system. Sometimes I touch more explicitly on the criminal justice system in my own work, but of course it really touches all aspects of society. It touches, yes, questions of domestic violence and why certain people, men, can move with a little bit more impunity at times. And also the socioeconomic background of certain men and the racial background of certain men. Why, when those kind of identities and those different factors really mix together, that you can see some very unequal results and unequal outcomes. even across those different lines on top of just race, right? On top of just gender. And so it is a question like why you have to look at all the different ways in which things are intersecting each other and having tangible material outcomes on people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's much more nuanced and complex than a lot of times we think of. That there are all these different layers to how we perceive other individuals and how we're going to use our political systems to process people differently. And one of the things that you and I have talked about is that there seems to be a problem with a lack of data. I mean, we're just not gathering it. That's part of why victim experiences are so important, because they've got real data in terms of, I mean, it's their experience, but we can look at it in terms of what the actual harm is to people that can inform us how we help them recover, but also can inform us as to what things maybe we need to connect to offenders to help them be more accountable and to help them realize what the harm was in the first place. But then we've got all these other layers about varying experiences. It really seems to me that we're not gathering enough data, and maybe the pathway to more data is not just collecting it, but to have more perspectives from the community that are part of the decision-making process.
Right. I mean, when we talk about collecting data, right, it's like we know with the criminal justice system, a lot of times the data that people think that they want to know, or is definitely that's put in front of their face, of course it's coming from one perspective. It's like, oh, well, what I want to hear is, what is your prosecution record or your prosecution rate? How many people are you putting away? How successful are you putting people away?
Well,
right?
how do you make the data say, yeah, you need more funding for that, right?
But then we don't ask about, well, what is the success rate of them actually rehabilitating into society? What is the actual rate at which these people come back and are productive members of society? Do we have that data? Do we even want to ask for that data? And we never seek that data to begin with. Or on the flip side, it's like, how many of the victims of crime feel satisfied with the outcome of the criminal justice system? Do we collect that data?
Sometimes we're not, but maybe a part of that is that we sort of have our ideas, and you know this as a researcher, when you have an idea of what you want the data to say, then you'll look for a reinforcement of it. And we have something like, for instance, take mandatory minimum sentences, which we know are racially inequitable in their enforcement. A lot of times if people want to say, all right, we're justified, we want the conclusion to be we're justified in having mandatory minimum sentences where we just put people away for a long period of time. And then we do so, maybe the guiding value of that is the guiding belief is that we just think people are inherently bad people, so they deserve a long prison term. If that's the beginning thought process, maybe we're just only going to collect the data that says, oh yeah, mandatory minimums keep really bad people away. But we often miss the boat, and there's been much more data in the past 20 years on this, that mandatory minimum sentences don't really reduce crime. They're overly costly, and the people end up going in, spending a lot of time in prison. They don't have resources for rehabilitation or education, and they end up being worse coming out. So prison itself ends up being something that contributes to recidivism. So part of it is the structure that we've got when we start out, right?
Right. I mean, I know we've talked about this a couple of times. Our community is always better with high conviction rates. If the community that was harmed is not better off, then is the path that you're on actually worth it? Right. And so we have to continue to think about those things, like crime and criminal justice punitive measures. If the community doesn't feel better off, they're not economically better off, their health and well-being, their emotional well-being is not better off, then perhaps what we're doing just wasn't working, regardless of what your data of conviction rates and mandatory minimums are saying.
Yeah. That's a great perspective. I'm going to bring folks back from the breakout rooms. going to send him a quick message that says, hey, everybody. Hey, everyone, I'm bringing you back. Love this real-time Zooming. Yeah, and it's interesting. I think that when we end up with these, with more of these community perspectives, it certainly gives us at least a fuller picture on where our blind spots are. That's really something that we talk about frequently is, you know, I'm one guy, I'm a white guy who grew up in, you know, with privilege. What are my blind spots? That's really the big question. And maybe we get that from the community. But it's interesting, we just got a comment on Facebook as we bring people in and we go back to the discussion regarding victims. We got a comment on Facebook that said, hey, look, you know, why aren't we going to offenders and making sure that they are accountable to the victims by really learning what the victim went through? You know, one thing to be stuck in a cell, which is, you know, awful, but some people, when they're very angry, you want somebody stuck away, but it doesn't really hold the offender accountable for what they actually did and what the impact was. So maybe we need to make that a part of it. Well, it looks like we've gotten a bunch of folks back. DJ, thank you for riffing with me, and I'm going to talk to you more about this week when we've got Dr. Brown along with us. So if I can open it up, and Mackie, you're in a room, and I'll leave it up to our panelists to sort of lead things along, but Mackie and Tisa and Erica, what kinds of things did you discuss in your rooms when it came to those questions about what you would want from your offender and what you would want their experience to be?
The why. I never got the why. Yeah. If I got the why, you know, I always wanted to know the why. I said I'm a firm believer that people don't just go out and do bad stuff simply because they feel like it. And I said there's no such thing as a bad child. I just think that bad things happen to certain people, and if we don't get them off that path, then they're just going to continue making the wrong decisions. So the why is what I wanted to know that I never got. Now, if I ever got the why, as far as the rehabilitation part, the day that my brother, that he was being sentenced, I remember telling him that I would never forgive you, you know, but that's out of anger and that's out of frustration, and that's understandable, you know. So going forward, I just look at it as I would want him to be rehabilitated. If I got the why, I think we all deserve a second chance, but I don't think if I ever got the why, then I don't think he should deserve a chance to be rehabilitated or to have a second chance, you know, because I don't feel like if you're not able to state the why, then I don't think you're actually accepted that accountability to your actions to deserve the rehab part.
Okay, accountability, that's a big part of it. Tisa, what did your group talk about?
Well, our group talked similar to what Erica talked about, the why, because I spoke to Zoe and Pastor Dixon, and we talked about, in my son's case, and his friend, we spent a whole week in court and never got the why. This young man never spoke at his trial. He never said essentially what transpired that would make it take it to that level. But then we also talked about what the reason was. Was it that this person is inherently evil and that was just it? But going back to what Mackie said, we already saw a development of an issue, because earlier that year, he was arrested and he was on a bond when he killed my son for domestic violence. He tried to kill his girlfriend. He tried to choke her and drown her in a tub, but he was let out on bail. And he was out on bail during the time he killed my son. And within hours of my son being killed, he was actually stopped by police for going 100 miles on a 35 mile per hour zone. So essentially, he kept having these encounters with law enforcement in a dangerous way that kind of was giving the signs that he was progressively getting worse and worse, which resulted in him murdering 2 people. So it's kind of like what Zoe was saying, that, you know, we just got to get down to the root of what in his mindset brought him to the point that he thought that taking lives was something that he could have done or should have done. As far as restorative, you know, for a person who may be getting out of jail, this young man is going to be in prison for life without the possibility of parole. But for a person who may be coming out, we didn't talk about the not getting the why, but I agree with Erica. If they can't own up to the why, I don't think they need to be given an opportunity for restoration in their life, because you've taken a life, and without any manner of apology or acknowledgement as to the why. But if you're someone who has admitted your crime and you've paid the price, and I believe that once you get out, you should be able to restore your life if you're willing to give back the community in a positive way. Because I've known people who've been in prison and they've come back, and you would never know it. They made tremendous progress. But, of course, we know when they check that box in the application, it says being convicted of a crime, they're paying again and again, which sometimes fails them. The system fails them when they're actually trying to do the right thing, because they end up back, because now they feel like they're in at a dead end, because they have no way of really providing for themselves or their families, which brings into that poverty and just the whole cycle of I can't get ahead.
Right.
And we see it a lot in the Black and Brown community, whereas though you can go in a courtroom and I can do crime. Ben and Pastor Dixon in the court, they do the same crime, have the same background. Ben gets community service. Pastor Dixon gets 5 years probation, if not 5 years in jail.
Yeah, we see
But
it.
so, and I've told a friend recently when we was talking about privilege and how the legal system is set up in a way that's not fair at all. We talked about it. I said, hey, when courts open back up free to the public, how about sit in a courtroom and just watch the different cases and see how the judges, encounter one case versus the other case. It's like you're not even giving a person a chance in those circumstances.
Who's got a paid lawyer, who's got a public defender, who's got attorneys at the bond hearing or not.
Exactly.
It sounds like there's a need from your group to, if somebody is in there, to have, some sort of rehabilitative process that makes them accountable, or at least gives them a pathway to accountability.
Yes.
All right. Great. And Mackie, what did your group talk about? What kinds of things did you guys come up with?
Well, I want to say something quickly because I didn't get a chance to say it in the breakout group, but I think it's really important. With domestic violence, it is so important for the victim to know he's not going to change. And we
absolutely, yeah.
And there is about a 2% chance at this point that an abuser will come out of prison and be able to be rehabilitated, or will go to jail and be in jail for a couple of nights and go to a class that's assigned to him by a judge, and then he's going to come home and
the right kind of class, right?
Well, there has
not even really addressing abuse to begin with,
right.
Yeah.
And it's a mindset of an abuser. There's something impenetrable about it. And the reason I'm saying this is because I don't want to give anybody false hope that they're going to go to prison, or they're going to even go to jail and come out and see the light. That doesn't happen. It's like I said, the percentage is about 2% that an abuser is going to be able to be rehabilitated. And it's sad. I mean, it's sad for the abuser as well as for the victim. But to me, I won't even go there in a discussion about what would you like to see happen after prison, or would you like to, what would you like for him to say to you? No, cut it completely.
Yeah.
It's cold. You got to go cold turkey. If you're, it's almost like an addiction, and you just got to stay away, and you can't have hope that this is going to be something that's reconcilable at some point. Because unfortunately with abusers, that is the case right now. And until we can come up with other ways of rehabilitation where they're actually being reached on a very deep level, that's something I hope dearly that happens and that can be created. But right now it doesn't exist. So anybody out there who is thinking, oh, they're gonna come back and be different, they're not.
No.
And I'm sorry to say that.
But that's
I mean,
reality. And it's like that, that's sort of, it's really a fairly unique to domestic violence.
Yes.
But when that's in such a different category than so many other different things.
Right.
You know, when
and
there-
just to plug in on that,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
just
go
to
ahead.
say, just like you said, Mackie, look at the young man who killed my son and the other guy, because
That's not
in the fact that this young lady actually was in court with him doing this trial for each day, told us that he still had a hold on her,
Oh yeah.
because the average person would think, I'm not coming around him. Thank God I don't have to be around him, because look what he did. This could have really been me.
Right.
And because they had a child together, I think that connection there makes them think that they have to stay.
Yes. And
So
there's
those dynamics, exactly, the guilt of, well, maybe if I stayed with him, maybe he wouldn't have been there with them and this would have happened.
Right.
So it's the dynamics of it. And when I found out months after it happened that he was out on bail for this reason, I was like, well, why was he even out?
Right.
Apparently he was showing you he had the ability to take a person's life, because had the cops not knocked on their door that evening, she would have been dead.
Yeah, and the special case of domestic violence really does separate folks away. And that's one of the reasons that getting that input from victims is so important, because we've got to understand what kind of mindset is the origin of committing a violent act. Is this a neighborhood incident where, or is it drug related? Is it mental illness related? Or is this a pattern of domestic abuse that we really need to treat totally differently? And how early, maybe with increased input from victims, how early can we identify that so that we can make sure we're putting somebody in the right path, whether it's a path that takes them away, that protects the rest of the community for somebody who's going to consistently offend, or is it someone where a case where if we look a little bit deeper, this is a person who's going through childhood crisis or mental illness or something like that, which is, a lot of time the case for non-domestic abusers. This has been fascinating, and I've kept everybody a little bit too long. I really cannot thank our panelists and our participants enough. These are difficult topics, and we do have great people working on these issues in the community, and we've got great passionate people in our law enforcement community and our solicitors' offices it is right now, and I hope that is something that we continue to make an even richer experience that helps everybody stay safer, that validates victims as well. It's certainly what I'm going to be trying to do. But having community discussions, I think, is a really healthy part of the equation, and a part that gives us more data, even if it's in our small group and with a whole lot of people on Facebook as well. So hopefully we can continue these discussions, integrating more community voices and move forward there. So thank you to all my guests. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have another forum next week. Don Polite is going to be here again. Don, thank you for being here, and Dr. Robert Brown from North Carolina Central University. Thank you, everyone who joined us on Facebook. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to our participants as well. Everybody have a great night. Stay healthy, stay safe when you're out there.
Put that mask on.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
night.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben.